Hello, welcome back. We just took a look at how resting membrane potential is determined and the factors that go into it, basically permeability and equilibrium potentials. Now we're ready to talk about electrical signals in cells. So I want to remind you that all cells in the body have a resting membrane potential, but we have particular excitable cell types, such as neurons, muscle, a few others, that are actually able to change their membrane potential to make signals. So we're going to be exploring that concept here. We're going to be looking at how cells generate electrical signals. All right, we're going to start with this same table that you saw in the previous video. This shows your typical permeabilities, typical equilibrium potentials for a neuron at rest. But let's imagine what is going to happen when we change the permeabilities in that cell. I want you to think through, now that we've changed these permeabilities, what effect is that going to have on the membrane potential? What's the new membrane potential going to be? How is it going to reach its new value? In other words, which ions are going to move and in what direction? So I'd like you to take a break to answer that question. Go ahead. Okay, so we'll go over the exact answer to that question in class, but the main point here is that we've changed permeabilities. That's going to change which ions can and can't cross the membrane, and as a result, the membrane potential is going to change, okay? So this is something that actually happens in neurons and other excitable cell types. I want to remind you that resting membrane potential is determined by these open channels, these leak channels that are open all the time. So we have our ions moving across the membrane, reaching some kind of equilibrium or disequilibrium in some cases, okay? The generation of electrical signals within a cell, an excitable cell type such as neurons, is governed by these gated channels. So we have these channels that can open or close under different conditions in response to certain stimuli. When those channels open and close, they're changing the permeability of the cell membrane to whatever ions go through them. Ions can then either move more easily or less easily, and as a result, that's going to change the membrane potential of the cell, okay? And it's those changes in membrane potential that we refer to as electrical signals. So an electrical signal is basically a change in membrane potential. And again, the change in membrane potential comes because we're opening and closing ion channels and letting ions move more easily or less easily across the membrane. So taking a closer look at these electrical signals, I just want to introduce some vocabulary to you here. But first, to orient you, we've got membrane, we have a graph here showing membrane potential on the y-axis, time on the x-axis. We're starting off at our resting membrane potential here. And then somewhere around here, we have some ion channels, open or close. Some ions are going to move. And then that's going to cause, in this case, it's going to cause the membrane potential to go down. We come back to our resting membrane potential. We have additional ion channels opening or closing. Additional ion movement, that's going to change the membrane potential again. If the membrane potential becomes more negative than the resting membrane potential, we call that a hyperpolarization, okay? Hyper, because it's becoming more polarized, the membrane potential is actually moving further away from zero. So that's why we call it hyperpolarization. And then if the membrane potential becomes more positive, we call that a depolarization because it's becoming less polarized. The membrane potential is getting closer to zero, so that difference between zero and whatever the membrane potential is getting smaller. Okay. So again, it's these little blips that are the electrical signals that we see in neurons and other excitable cell types. And in the next couple lectures, you'll learn a lot more about specific kinds of electrical signals that we see in neurons. Okay, so that wraps up our discussion of electrical signals in cells. Now you know what electrical signals are, what their nature is. These are your learning goals. Here's your vocabulary. See you next time.